Remember that feeling? That knot in your stomach the night before a big exam?
Yeah.
Cramming facts, you'll forget by morning. Or walking out feeling like the test only measured how good you were at bubbling in answers, not if you actually understood anything.
Or, getting that test back with just a grade,
Hmm.
maybe a few red marks, but no real sense of why you struggled. Or, more importantly, like how you could do better next time.
Yeah.
It felt less like feedback and, I don't know, more like a final verdict.
That anxiety, that feeling of assessment being this huge, high stakes, end of the road judgment, that's exactly the traditional model we're diving into today
Hmm.
and how it's beginning to fundamentally transform.
Mm.
We're exploring this really big shift happening in education, moving from testing to learning.
Yeah.
It's all about assessment changing from something, done to students to something that actively works for them,
Right.
with them.
Right, even as part of their learning process itself.
Ex-
And this deep dive, it's inspired by insights from Dr. Jae Choi, who's an associate professor over at George Washington University. These come from lecture notes titled From Testing to Learning: How Assessment as Learning is Reshaping Education with AI.
Okay.
Dr. Choi is also the principal investigator behind a pretty significant initiative in this area.
Mm.
Its earlier work, which was really focused on using tech to help assessment aid learning, was known by a name pronounced like CAPA.
CAPA.
Okay.
Right, CAPA, ICEP. I remember hearing about that focus on computer adaptive formative assessment. It makes sense that it really set the stage, using technology to personalize assessment, make it more useful while you're learning.
Precisely. And while the initiative has obviously evolved since then, that core idea, adaptive learning-focused assessment, it's still absolutely central. It connects that history to where things are going now.
Gotcha. So our mission today is to unpack this massive shift. We'll dig into the core ideas driving an assessment for learning and assessment as learning.
Yep, AFL and AAL.
We'll look at a framework that kind of pulls it all together called learning-oriented assessment. And then, crucially, how technology, especially AI, isn't just helping.
It's creating totally new possibilities, right?
Yeah.
For these really adaptive, personalized learning experiences. It's pretty amazing stuff.
All right, let's start by setting the scene. The world most of us experience traditional testing. The source material calls this assessment of learning, AOL.
Right. AOL, that's the standard model we all know. It's usually summative, happens at the end of a unit, end of the year.
Finals, standardized tests.
Exactly. Big exams, final papers graded for a score. The main goal is just measurement. Figure out what a student learned up to that point, slap a grade on it, rank them maybe, or say, yep, they met the standard.
And look, measurement has its place, obviously, but this traditional approach, it has some serious downsides, as these notes really lay out. It can actually constrain learning.
Yeah, students focus on just memorizing enough to pass,
Yeah.
not really understanding deeply.
It creates that anxiety we mentioned. And critically, like in math or science problem solving, it often only cares about the final answer.
Hmm. You don't see the student's process. You don't see their thinking, where they went wrong.
Or how they thought about it. The actual learning journey is just invisible.
Right. And that narrow focus on the score, it drives some really unhelpful practices in schools.
Like teaching to the test. We've all heard that. The curriculum just shrinks to fit whatever's on the exam.
And the whole learn and forget cycle. You cram for the test, spit it out, and then it's gone because you never really integrated it or used it.
It can also foster this unhealthy competition sometimes, focusing just on individual scores instead of maybe learning together.
Totally. And let's face it, there's a really deep-seated testing culture in a lot of places. It's baked into policies, how schools are judged. It creates this huge inertia.
So changing it isn't just about new techniques.
No, it requires a whole shift in mindset about what assessment is even for.
Okay, so the desire for change is clear. How do we actually move assessment beyond being just that final judgment? How do we make it part of the learning, something ongoing, designed to help students learn better?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The push is really to use assessment to diagnose needs, give useful feedback, and guide both the student's learning and the teacher's instruction while learning is happening.
So using it proactively.
Exactly. You see reforms trying this, like the Continuous and Comprehensive Evaluation,
Yeah.
CCE, in India. The goal isn't necessarily to get rid of summative tests entirely,
Right.
but to make sure they measure the rich learning that comes from these more growth-focused processes, not just, surface-level stuff.
Which leads us nicely into the first big concept driving this change, assessment for learning, AFL.
AFL, yeah, this is all about assessment being woven into the teaching and learning cycle. It's ongoing, it's formative, meaning it happens during learning, and its main purpose is to generate feedback.
Feedback for who?
For both the student and the teacher, to help them improve the learning process right then and there. It's about using that assessment evidence to make better decisions in the moment.
This sounds like that foundational work by people like Paul Black and Dylan William. They had a really clear definition for this, didn't they?
They did. It's something like practice in a classroom is formative to the extent that evidence about student achievement is elicited, interpreted, and used by teachers, learners, or their peers to make decisions about the next steps in instruction.
That are likely to be better or better founded than the decisions they would have taken in the absence of the evidence that was elicited.
Wow, okay, so it's about using evidence during the process.
To improve things as you go.
Yeah.
This really changes how you think about assessment's role. It's not just tacked on at the end.
No, it becomes part of the planning from the start. And the focus shifts, too. It's less about just the right answer and more about understanding how students are thinking their process, where they're struggling.
So it's central to just daily classroom practice.
Absolutely. And it requires teachers to develop some really sophisticated skills, actually, interpreting all that evidence they're gathering.
And the feedback itself must be different, too.
Totally. It has to be sensitive, constructive. It should build motivation, not just point out mistakes. Helping students really get the goals and what success looks like, that's key.
That where am I going question you mentioned.
Exactly. And then helping them figure out how am I doing? And crucially, where do I go next? AFL also really pushes for developing students' ability to assess themselves and their peers.
Putting the learners more at the center. So, practically speaking, what does this look like in a real classroom? What are some AFL strategies?
Well, Dr. Choi's notes pull out a few core ones. First, making those learning intentions and success criteria super clear and sharing them with students. Kids need to know exactly what they're trying to learn and what it looks like when they've got it.
Like that WWI example you gave, not just learn WWI, but we're focusing on the causes of WWI. And you'll nail it if you can explain, say, 3 major ones and connect them to the war starting. That clarity makes a difference.
A huge difference. Second, teachers need ways to actually get evidence of understanding during the lesson. This means asking good questions. Not just any questions, but open-ended ones that reveal thinking.
Right.
Using things like hinge questions, questions at a critical point where you need to know if everyone's ready to move on.
Like asking students to explain a science concept in their own words, maybe, or show different ways to solve a math problem.
Exactly. And simple tools can really help make that thinking visible. Mini whiteboards where everyone shows an answer. Traffic light cards, red, yellow, green to show confidence levels. Quick exit tickets at the end of class.
What's one thing you learn, one thing you're still fuzzy on?
Yeah. Or think pair share, just getting students talking to each other. It all surfaces understanding.
Okay, and then there's the feedback itself. You called it the engine of AFL.
It really is. It's not just about marking. It's providing feedback that's timely, specific, actionable feedback that helps students answer those key questions. Where am I going? How am I doing? Where to next? That's from Hattie and Timperley's work.
The character analysis example was good for that. Your analysis of the motivation is strong, and you could make it even better by adding specific examples from Act 3 right here. It says what's good and gives a concrete next step.
Yes. It's constructive, it's forward-looking, and, building a classroom culture where mistakes are okay, where feedback is seen as helpful support, that's absolutely vital for AFL to actually work.
This seems to lead naturally into the role of students assessing themselves and their peers. Peer and self-assessment.
Yeah, this is where students start becoming really active players in the whole feedback game, like Black and William talked about. Peer assessment is basically students using clear criteria to look at a classmate's work and give helpful feedback.
Like that 2 stars and a wish idea. 2 things done well. 1 suggestion for improvement. Needs clear guidelines, I imagine.
Definitely needs clear criteria, and the teacher modeling it first. And then self-assessment is students taking those same criteria and applying them to their own work, reflecting on how they did, spotting their own strengths and weaknesses, and figuring out their own where to next.
So they're internalizing that feedback loop themselves.
Exactly. It forces them to understand the goals and the standards really deeply. And they have to feel safe enough to be honest in their reflections.
What kind of tools help with that?
Using rubrics for self-evaluation is common. Keeping reflection journals. Building portfolios where they don't just put work but reflect on their growth. Even those exit tickets asking, what was hardest for you today, can be a form of self-assessment.
Okay, so what's the overall impact? What happens when schools really lean into AFL?
The research suggests pretty significant positive effects. It boosts student motivation, The focus shifts to progress, not just comparing scores. Engagement goes up because
Hmm.
students are actually involved, and it's linked to real improvements in academic achievement. Plus, maybe most importantly, it helps students build those crucial metacognitive strategies thinking about their own learning.
How so?
Well, self-assessment, especially, empowers students to find their own errors and figure out how to fix them. That builds confidence, deeper understanding, and makes them better learners in the long run.
That's powerful stuff. Okay, so AFL is assessment for learning, guided by the teacher, lots of feedback loops. Now let's push that idea even further. Assessment as learning, AAL, putting the student even more in charge.
That's the core idea of AL. It takes that integration of assessment and learning up another notch. Here, assessment isn't just informing learning. It kind of becomes a fundamental part of the learning process itself. And it's largely driven by the student.
The student as the active agent.
Exactly. They're the ones making connections, monitoring themselves, driving the assessment part of their learning.
And you said the key concept here is metacognition.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
AIL is fundamentally about building that metacognitive muscle, helping students become aware of and able to direct their own thinking,
So they learn to reflect on what they're learning, how they're learning it.
monitor their own understanding, spot the gaps, and consciously choose different strategies if something isn't working.
Hmm.
It's really about the student becoming their own best assessor and taking real ownership of their learning.
How is that different from AFL then? They sound pretty closely related.
They are related, but there's a key difference in emphasis. In AFL, while students use feedback, the teacher is often still the main conductor, right? Gathering evidence, designing the feedback process for the student.
Okay.
AL really puts the student in the driver's seat much more explicitly. The focus is squarely on student self-monitoring, self-evaluation, self-regulation as a core activity. The agency shifts much more towards the learner.
You mentioned self-regulated learning, SRL, before. Is that tightly linked with AAL and metacognition?
Oh, definitely. Metacognition is that awareness, knowing how you think, planning your approach, monitoring yourself. SRL is the broader action-setting goals, actively managing your learning, your thinking, your motivation, your actions to reach those goals and adjusting as needed. Self-assessment is a huge part of SRL.
And AAL practices are designed to build those SRL skills.
Precisely. When students do AAO activities like using a rubric on their own draft or reflecting on why a strategy didn't work, they are practicing monitoring, analyzing feedback, even self-generated feedback, and adjusting.
What's the teacher's role then in AAL?
The teacher becomes more of a facilitator. They model good self-assessment, help students learn how to set effective goals, provide examples of quality work so students know what they're aiming for, co-create criteria sometimes, and crucially create that safe space where it's okay to struggle and make mistakes during learning.
I see that note about a reciprocal relationship. You need some metacognitive skill to do AAL, but doing AAL builds those skills.
Exactly right. It's a positive feedback loop. It often means you need to explicitly teach some of these strategies up front, how to self-assess, how to set goals, but the practice students get through AAL activities is what really strengthens those skills over time.
And how does ALL help develop critical thinking?
That's a major payoff.
Yeah.
ADL moves students way beyond just passively receiving information. They have to actively judge their own work against standards. They have to identify problems in their own understanding and figure out how to fix them.
So becoming a critical assessor of your own learning.
Yes. So that requires applying analytical skills, making reasoned judgments, using a rubric on your own essay, reflecting on why you struggled with the concept and what you'll try differently next time. That is critical thinking in action.
Okay. The skills are transferable then.
Absolutely. Self-monitoring, questioning your assumptions, evaluating your approach. These are core critical thinking skills you need for learning throughout life.
So let's talk practical examples again. How does AAL actually look in practice?
Well, a lot of things teachers already do can be powerful AAL tools if framed right. Self-assessment using detailed rubrics is a big one. Keeping reflection journals. Building portfolios where students curate work and write about their learning journey.
Those quick check-ins too.
Yeah, admit or exit tickets like the 3-2-1 countdown, 3 things learned, 2 questions, 1 connection. Even simple KWL charts, what I know, want to know, learned. That's a form of self-monitoring your learning path.
And peer assessment fits here too.
It does, because when students evaluate peers based on criteria, they have to internalize those criteria, which helps them apply it to their own work later. So structured peer review is definitely an AAL practice.
What about goal setting?
Huge part of it. Guiding students to set their own SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, and then track their own progress towards them. That's pure AAL and SRL.
And dedicated reflection time.
Yes, building in time and maybe providing prompts for students to reflect specifically on their learning process, the challenges they faced, the strategies they used, not just the final product.
And things like inquiry-based learning or project-based learning must naturally involve AAL.
Absolutely. Those kinds of projects basically require students to constantly monitor their progress, figure out next steps, solve problems along the way, and reflect on their learning throughout. The example given about student groups actually setting their own tasks, doing them, and then marking and giving feedback on them, that's AAL fully embedded. They're acting as both learner and assessor.
Okay, so we've got assessment of learning, AOL, the traditional grade, assessment for learning, AFL, feedback guiding the process, and assessment as learning, AAL, the student driving metacognition. How do these all fit together? Is there a bigger picture?
There is. And that's where learning-oriented assessment, or LOA, comes into play. You can think of LOA as this comprehensive framework that puts learning right at the very heart of all assessment activities. It tries to bridge the gap to make instruction, learning, and assessment feel like one seamless thing.
And Professor David Carlis is the key name associated with LOA. Described as an umbrella term,
That's right. Carla sees LOA as covering any assessment practice, whether it's traditionally seen as formative or summative, that's intentionally designed to prioritize and promote student learning. He lays out three core strands, all interconnected, that define LOA.
okay, strand one. Assessment tasks should be learning tasks.
This is fundamental. The tasks we ask students to do for assessment shouldn't just measure learning, they should cause learning. They need to be authentic, mirror real-world situations or problems.
So not just multiple choice questions about history dates, maybe analyzing primary sources.
Exactly. Tasks should embody the actual outcomes we want, push for deeper, higher-order thinking. They should encourage sustained work over time, not just last-minute cramming. And importantly, they need to feel relevant and meaningful to the student.
Makes sense. Strand two, student involvement in assessment.
Yes. This pulls heavily from AAL. Students aren't passive targets of assessment, they're active participants. This means they need to really understand and engage with the criteria for success. They should use exemplars to get a feel for what quality looks like.
And participate in peer and self-assessment.
Definitely. All of this helps them build what Carlos calls evaluative expertise, the ability to make smart judgments about quality, both in their own work and in others.
Okay. And strand three, feedback as feed forward.
Right. Feedback isn't just about the past assignment. It needs to be timely, actionable, and specifically focused on helping the student improve their future work. It should look ahead.
So it's not just justifying the grade you gave.
No. And it should come from different places, the teacher, sure, but also peers, and importantly, from the student's own self-reflection. Students then need to actually use that feedback to guide their next steps.
So LOA isn't about throwing out summative assessments, but redesigning them. Even a final exam could be more LOA focused if it uses authentic tasks, involves student reflection, and provides feedback useful for the future.
That's the idea. The core principle is that any assessment, regardless of its timing or stakes, should contribute positively to learning. A final project could hit all three strands. Authentic tasks, strand one, involving peer self-review during development, strand two, and offering feedback focused on skills applicable beyond the course, strand three. It really harmonizes AFL, AAL, and even thoughtfully designed AOL within a learning-first system.
And that active student role is absolutely key in LOA.
Non-negotiable. It's critical for developing that sense of agency, the self-regulation skills, and ultimately the capacity for lifelong learning. Students have to be partners in the assessment process.
And feedback is the fuel for this whole thing.
You could say that. Timely, actionable, forward-looking feedback is the engine. It provides the information needed for regulation, for teachers to adjust teaching, and for students to adjust learning. And linking it all to authentic tasks connects LOA directly to preparing students for the kinds of evaluation and learning they'll encounter outside of school.
Okay, this shift from old school testing to LOA is already huge, but now technology and AI are throwing another massive variable into the mix. How does tech fit into this picture?
Well, technology has already been a huge help in making AFL and AIL more practical. Things like automated assessment systems, digital platforms. They allow for more frequent formative checks, give instant feedback, support adaptive learning.
And give students tools to track their own progress,
Right.
supporting that self-regulated learning.
Exactly. And those adaptive learning systems, ALS, they were really central to that early CAPA initiative focus we talked about.
Right. How did they help specifically?
Well, systems based on ALS principles give students platforms for lots of practice, immediate feedback that's tailored to their answer, and ways to see their mastery grow over time. That really supports SRL students control the pace, they get clear feedback loops.
The principles listed for automatic formative assessment seem to map directly onto AFLL goals.
They really do. Think about accessibility practice anytime. Algorithms that change the numbers and problems, so you have to understand the process, not just memorize an answer.
Right, can't just copy the answer from last time.
Exactly. Handling open-ended responses, giving immediate feedback right when it's most useful, putting problems in real-world context, and offering guided help step by step when you get stuck.
Plus, these systems gather a ton of data.
Yeah, rich data, how many tries, how much time, what kinds of errors. That gives personalized insights back to the student and powerful diagnostic info for the teacher to maybe adjust their instruction.
But the point isn't just making grading faster.
No, the profound impact is enabling new ways of teaching, truly individualized feedback, adaptive learning paths, things that were just impossible to do for every student at scale before tech.
And now, generative AI, LLMs, this is the game changer, according to the source.
This is what Dr. Choi highlights as the new paradigm shift. AI, particularly generative AI with large language models, is said to absolutely reshape assessment and teaching. And adaptive learning, specifically, is probably where we'll see the biggest leap.
How do LLMs go beyond what adaptive tech could do before?
Well, they can give explanations and feedback that are way more nuanced, contextualized, and elaborate than the sort of canned responses older systems might give.
Okay.
They can generate not just slightly different versions of the same problem, but whole new practice problems that adapt in real time to exactly where the student is struggling, even targeting specific misunderstandings the AI picks up on.
And the interaction is different.
Much more sophisticated. We're moving towards things like Socratic dialogues, where the AI probes deeper thinking, not just checking answers. And crucially, they can start to handle a complex, open-ended tasks.
Like evaluating an argument or
Right.
creativity.
Exactly. Giving formative feedback on the structure of an argument, the originality of a solution, the effectiveness of a strategy, things that were incredibly hard to automate before. It starts to feel less like using a program and more like having an AI co-pilot for your learning.
And the source mentions generative agents and collective AI. This sounds like where that CUPA initiative is now, the collective AI on the foundation AI idea.
That's exactly the frontier described. It's not just one big AI model, but systems using specialized collaborative AI agents, these generative agents. Maybe one agent creates problems, another gives feedback, another monitors how the student is feeling, and they all work together.
To create this really integrated, responsive learning experience.
At scale.
Yeah.
This collective AI on the foundation AI architecture, the one associated with CAPA, is seen as the key to really unlocking AI's potential for truly adaptive learning.
And the last piece, assessment on the AI, AOA. What is that? Sounds intriguing.
It is pretty mind-bending. The idea here is that the AI system isn't just assessing the student, it's constantly assessing itself. It's evaluating the whole learning process and its own effectiveness in supporting that student.
So the AI is learning how to teach better?
In a way, yes. It's analyzing how the student responds, whether its interventions are actually working, and dynamically adjusting its entire collective approach to optimize for that individual learner.
It's this continuous feedback loop for the AI, constantly aligning itself better with the learner's needs.
Wow. Okay, so we've gone from traditional testing assessment of learning, static measurement, through assessment for learning, AFL, and assessment as learning, AAL, integrated processes focused on growth, feedback, student agency, all brought together under the learning-oriented assessment, LOA, framework. And now AI, especially generative AI, collective AI, like the CAPA initiative it's developing, and this idea of assessment on the AI, it promises to just supercharge this whole shift, enabling truly adaptive, personalized learning where even the system learns. It's a really profound reimagining of what assessment can be, moving it from, a gatekeeper or a finish line to being this dynamic, continuous partner in the learning journey itself.
Using tech to empower learners, build their skills.
And equip them for a future where learning constantly needs to happen.
So here's the thought that leaves me spinning. If assessment becomes this continuous AI-driven conversation that adapts to you personally, and the AI is even assessing its own teaching effectiveness, How does that fundamentally change what it even means to learn or to teach? Does it change the very idea of what a school is for?
That is a truly compelling question, and honestly one that the future of education is only just starting to grapple with.
Indeed. And that's our deep dive for today.